We're about to go into public session. Okay, as we have a quorum of 6 members, including at least one Chaptadala, Agus Dora Warren, we have commenced the meeting. We are in public session. I want to remind members to switch off their mobile phones because it interferes with the broadcast capability and therefore proceedings will not be transmitted. We have received apologies from Deputy Catherine Murphy and Senator Ned O'Sullivan. This meeting has been convened for the purpose of the consideration by this committee of matters relating to the consultation paper on the establishment of an electoral commission in Ireland. The committee will now discuss this matter. Is that agreed? Proposal for a private meeting. Okay, it's proposed that this part of our meeting shall conclude at 4:30 unless previously concluded, and at the conclusion of public business we will then go to private session to discuss other committee business. Is this agreed? I want to welcome the following witnesses to the meeting: Ms Helen Dixon, the Data Protection Commissioner, Mr Tim Duggan, the Assistant Secretary, and Ms Michelle O'Donnell, Client Identity Service in the Department of Social Protection, Dr Adrian Kavanagh, a Lecturer in Geography from NUI Maynooth, Mr Sean Donnelly, Political Analyst, and Mr Liam Kenny from the Association of Irish Local Government. Mr Kenny, might you just introduce your 4 colleagues to us, please?
Yes, the 4 elected representatives here from the association are Councillor Aidan Davish from Westmeath County Council, who will introduce our short presentation, Councillor Damien Geoghegan from Waterford County Council, Councillor Christy Hyland from Mayo County Council and the Westport Municipal District, I have to mention that, and Councillor Peter McVitie from Cavan County Council. And Mr David will do the opening presentation on behalf of the Association of Local Government. I'm just going to read out the warning for our witnesses. Just bear with me for a minute or two. I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(l) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if you are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or entity by name, or in any such way as to make him, her or it identifiable. It is proposed that all opening statements and any other documents provided by the witnesses may be published on the committee website post the conclusion of the meeting. Is that agreed? Okay, I'm going to do the same format as we do here every week. I'm going to call on members to make their opening remarks stroke questions. And we're going to limit that to about 10 minutes. We have a lot of witnesses here today and not everybody is going to get to speak per questioner. Now some members, I'm going to give everyone 10 minutes for questions and answers. Now if some members go up to the 10 minutes, you're going to eat into the time remaining for witnesses to answer those questions. So please be mindful of that. Whoever is in possession after 10 minutes, I shall ask them to conclude and carry on to the next questioner. This is the final of 6 planned meetings that the Joint Committee has had in relation to the proposal to establish an electoral commission for Ireland. We've heard from the Minister for the Environment, Mr Alan Kelly TD, followed by academics, office holders, local government and national agencies and bodies, and various experts. During the course of our hearings, numerous witnesses have told us that there are 31 electoral registers in Ireland, and the absence of a unique identifier such, for example, as the PPSN is causing huge difficulties with updating the register. That's going to feature strongly, obviously, in the context of our deliberations. So today we'll be taking questions in that matter and also taking the views of those who are involved in elections. In anticipation of that, we're going to produce a report, obviously, in September. But I think the views of people who are analysts and people who are involved in elections is hugely important to our work in terms of how we arrive at the whole issue of what we propose to the Minister in the context of the Electoral Commission. I am now going to call on the witnesses to make their opening statements, and I'm going to begin with the Commissioner, Ms Helen Dixon.
Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you to the committee for this opportunity to engage with you on the important data protection considerations that might arise in relation to any reform of the electoral registration process. Specifically, as the Chairman has outlined, I know the committee is interested in looking at whether the PPSN would be a solution to accuracy, omission and duplication issues with the register, and I'm well aware that the committee has been informed by various witnesses at this stage that use of the PPSN would of course be no trivial matter. So in the statement I submitted to you in advance of the committee meeting, I've set out some of the specific considerations around security risks that can arise through over-reliance in the state on one identifier and the ability that could be created to link potentially unlawfully across a variety of government databases. So I think what's at issue here is to find the balance. Apologies. Sorry. I think what's at issue here is to find the balance between the fundamental right of individuals to have their personal data protected and the public interest then in democratic legitimacy through having an accurate voter register. And so in order to correctly find that balance, the committee and the Oireachtas will need to ensure that the very specific context in which additional personal data would now be processed is detailed and analysed. In data protection terms, the devil can often be in the detail of implementation. So, for example, a registration system that could involve a centralised verification service within a government department through which local authorities and new individuals who wanted to register electronically could submit their applications and have them validated would be very different. And such a system where it didn't retain the PPSNs once it had completed a validation exercise would be very different from a system proposed that would involve a centralised electoral register run by one state body and where the PPSNs would be permanently retained. So I think we need to understand in detail what we mean by use of the PPSN to resolve the issues with the electoral register. So it is important that we could be clear as to specifically for what precisely and in what circumstances and by whom and how the PPSN would be used in any proposal. Equally, however, I think it would be preferable to start examining a range of solutions to the issues identified with the register and testing these solutions to see if they resolve the issues that have been identified. The committee has previously heard that there are potentially more PPSNs than persons eligible to vote, and conceivably persons eligible to vote who do not have a PPSN. So a range of solutions would need to be identified anyway to deal with these issues. Solutions would need to be assessed also so that they don't cause further issues beyond those that are sought to be resolved. And then ultimately, in relation to any final proposal, a thorough privacy impact assessment would need to be carried out on the proposed solution to ensure that the implementation delivers the best protection of personal data as well as the most effective and efficient process for dealing with personal data. Thank you.
Very much indeed, Commissioner. Now I'm going to call on Mr Duggan to make his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman, for the invitation to appear before the committee today. I have responsibility in the Department of Social Protection for Client Identity Services, which manages the Personal Public Services Number, or PPS number as it's more generally referred to, the associated public service identity data set that goes with that number, and then the public services card, which is in rollout at the moment. And we support the use of all three of those across the entire public service. So I'm going to briefly describe each of them for the committee to make sure that you have a full understanding of them and their relationship with each other, and then perhaps give a quick view on the part they might be able to play in an electoral register. So to begin with, the PPS number, as I think you know well, is an individual's unique reference number for all dealings with government departments and public bodies, and how it's governed is set out in the Social Welfare Consolidation Act of 2005. Only those government departments or public bodies that are authorised by that legislation or their agents can use the PPS number as a personal identifier, and a body that is so authorised is usually referred to as a specified body. So a PPS number is automatically issued in the case of children born in Ireland. In other cases, PPS numbers are issued following a controlled procedure involving a personal attendance at one of the department's dedicated PPS number registration centres, submission of a completed application form, the capture of a photograph and a signature, the submission of appropriate identity documents and proof of address, as well as the capture of additional data such as answers to security questions that we use subsequently to ensure the future integrity of that data, that someone else can't change it, in other words. So we publish the information on that process in a whole load of places, including our own offices and citizens' information centres, in embassies, in immigration advice centres, and so on. So as a result, usually people who attend our offices to get a PPS number are well informed, have all of the necessary documentation, and it's only in very rare circumstances will somebody have to attend more than once to get allocated a PPS number. Associated with that number is a full identity data set, known as the Public Service Identity Data Set. And that itself is also set out in legislation in the Social Welfare Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2002. And currently, that data set consists of the PPS number, but also a person's surname, their forename, their date of birth, place of birth, their sex, their address, their nationality, their photograph, their signature, any former surnames they may have had, any former surnames that their mother may have had, their date of death in the case of a deceased person, and then any other information that the Minister may prescribe as necessary to validate and authenticate an identity. That last piece has not been used to date. Now, in addition to the two of those, there is the Public Services Card, which increasingly more and more people are getting, particularly if they are customers of any kind of the Department of Social Protection. The purpose of the Public Service Card is to provide people with a robust token of identity to enable them to gain access to public services more efficiently and with a minimum of duplication of effort, while at the same time preserving their privacy to the maximum extent possible. It is designed to replace other cards that people currently use in the public sector, and examples of that include the free travel pass that a lot of our customers would have, the social services card, and it has the potential to replace a great deal of other cards as well, and they're currently being examined. Considerable progress has already been made in the rollout of this public services card. Over 1.46 million cards have been issued up to yesterday, and that includes 464,000 free travel versions of it. Face-to-face registration for the card is taking place countrywide in 97 offices of the department, and some customers whose identity is regularly authenticated in a face-to-face process can avail of an easier postal registration process. Registration is now required for individual adult applicants for a PPS number and for people applying for or in receipt of social protection payments or benefits. So in other words, it is no longer possible to get a PPS number without registering for a public services card as well. In order to ensure that a person receives only one PPS number and that the public service card is allocated on information that is accurate and verified, certain operational procedures are prescribed for registration personnel when dealing with applications. It's necessary to have effective controls around the process to guard against fraud and to protect the integrity of the data. So evidence of identity is a vital element of the process. Once an identity of an individual is verified, his or her relevant identity data is entered on our records, and a batch process is run each night then to allocate the PPS number itself. A number of system validation checks are part of this process to prevent multiple numbers being issued to the same person. The accuracy of the information gathered from the individual is therefore critically important to that process. The face-to-face process for someone who already has a number involves the capture of their photograph and their signature, the verification of their identity through documentation and through checks of back-end databases, and their current address through documentation again, as well as capturing some security questions. As part of the rollout, we have invested in facial recognition software, which ensures that multiple or fraudulent identities can be detected at the point of registration. In other words, if somebody is already registered and seeks to register again under a different identity set, the facial image recognition technology that we use will prevent that occurring in the main. During the course of the process, the software searches for photographs that we already have on our database against that scanned in for the individual applicant. Only when all of those checks are completed will a public service card issue to a person, and today that is the only means by which a PPS number can be issued as well. So as a result, a public service card now provides a very substantial assurance of the identity of the holder of that card. We transfer our identity data to a system called a single customer view, which is operated by the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform on our behalf. This provides a central repository of identity data, that data that I said was in the public service identity data set, and that can be used by other public bodies to do two things. The first is to verify the public service identity data that's presented by somebody coming to them, and secondly, to provide them with assurance on the verification status of a person's identity. And I can go into detail on that if the committee so wishes. So to sum up, the PSC registration process is by far the most robust system of identity verification in the state today. In this context, we understand that the Minister for Foreign Affairs, for example, has decided that in the future, new applicants for passports will have to undergo a PSC registration before they can receive a passport. In addition to that, we understand that the Road Safety Authority is upgrading its National Driver Licence Service application process so that it is compatible with our PSC registration process, and therefore somebody who applies and gets a driver's licence will equally get a public service card on the back of the same registration process, because they will be aligned. And the committee may also wish to note that Statutory Instrument 35 of 2014 provides that the public service card is specified as an identification document acceptable in the electoral process. In other words, a person can prove their identity at a polling station using just a public services card. So then finally, the electoral register. The department does, in short, consider that the PPS number, the public service identity data set that I outlined, and the public services card, that all of them could have a role to play in the establishment of the electoral register, in its subsequent maintenance, and in checking against it. And in that regard, we'd be more than willing to discuss the implications of the PPSN being used as the unique identifier for those purposes. We do believe that if this is being seriously considered, there is no point in using the number just for setting up the register. That data would need to be maintained, and this would require, in our view, regular exchanges of data, most likely through that single customer view system that I mentioned earlier. Accordingly, the department's view is that this could best be facilitated through a single register to avoid duplicate entries across multiple registers, although we do take the Data Protection Commissioner's point that there may be an alternative central verification mechanism through which this could be done. In this context, there may be a need to look at the legislation and data protection memorandum of agreement so that data can be legitimately exchanged between the relevant public bodies. The department would obviously not be in favour of making the PPS number publicly available, along with other register data that is made so publicly available. The department thinks that it may be feasible to consider the public services card as the means by which a person proves their identity at a polling station, as it would provide both a physical check in terms of the name and photograph on the card, but also a system check using the PPS number that's on the card against the register. I think finally it's probably worthwhile noting the fact that just because a person has a PPS number, that does not confer any rights of any kind on them. It simply means that they've registered their identity to a very high level with the Department of Social Protection. So it confers no rights, and most especially doesn't confer any rights to vote on a person. So the department is clear that the decision on who has the right to vote would be outside its remit in this regard, but we'd be more than happy to discuss that with the relevant departments if it wants to explore the issue further, and I'll do my best to answer any questions the committee may have.
Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Adrian Kavanagh.
Thank you. I've just compiled, you've heard the committee, thanks to the Gaeltacht, by the way, and the committee for inviting me here. The committee's heard from a number of academics beforehand, from political science and from geography, so I won't be giving you the same level of detail as people like Dr. Teresa Reedy or Professor David Farrell offered. I've just put together a few ideas in terms of what I see as important in relation to the proposed Electoral Commission. So I've grouped them under the ideas of reform, independence, information, value for money, and administration/organisation. In relation to reform, I would argue that the main driver function of the proposed commission, or the raison d'etre, really should be to focus on reform. A lot of talk is about the importance of a commission in terms of improving the quality of the electoral register, but my argument is where the commission could be most valuable is in the area of electoral reform. So that could involve looking at various innovations in terms of improving electoral practice or the sharing of electoral information, and also as a body that's able to learn from international precedents in terms of good practice, but also able to learn from good ideas about elections or improving the electoral process that they gain from the Irish public themselves or from experts in the field, be they academics, be they experts, other experts in the area of elections, such as Sean here, for instance, or be they people practitioners in the field, such as people who work in the area of electoral administration, or indeed politicians themselves. An electoral commission, I think, would be important because, as the last few years have shown, where there's instances or accusations of partisan bias, it can be very hard to get certain electoral reform ideas across or passed. If you look at what's happened over the last few years, the Shannon referendum failed for different reasons. And of course, most recently, we had the total collapse of the referendum to reduce the age of presidential election candidates. In part, I would argue the main problem with there was that these were represented or sometimes misrepresented as basically trying to get too much power for the Dáil or so on. If you've got ideas being put forward by an independent body, in theory, it mightn't work out, but in theory at least, you should be able to overcome those partisan bias concerns that might otherwise nix good ideas in relation to electoral reform. The Electoral Commission would also be able, I would suggest, to drive certain reform efforts from an organisational perspective in the way that other bodies might not be able to do so. One area that I suspect will become a major issue in relation to electoral reform in the next few years would be focusing on the area of voting rights for the Irish diaspora. I was talking to the European Affairs Committee, Union Affairs Committee about this a few months, and I suspect this is an issue that may become a fairly significant area in relation to electoral reform in the next few years. So there's certain electoral reform efforts that you probably need a centralised independent body to push through over and above what can be done by a body that's more tied in to, say, the government or tied into the Department of Environment or the different local authorities or local bodies. The next point then, independence. As I said before, if you've got an independent commission, I would argue that commission is better, should in theory be better placed to drive or push a reform agenda and get public acceptance for this than might be the case if it's seen to be pushed by certain politicians or by the government. In relation to this, the leadership of the Commission, or the leader, if it's decided to go down the route of having, as certain people are referred to as, if you can decide to go down the route of having an electoral officer or elections ombudsman or elections czar to head up this body, I would argue that the main thing to ensure the independence is that the leadership of that should be, as far as is practical, drawn from outside the political sector, but also drawn from outside the administrative elite in the country as well. The big issue in relation, two big issues in relation to independence, of course. How can a Commission's ideas become policy? So all the Commission can do in relation to driving forward new ideas in terms of improving electoral practice, all they can do really is put forward proposals. So a bit of thought probably needs to be put into what's the step between turning proposals into policy. So generally I suspect the best model is that proposals from the Commission should go before the Seanad and the Dáil for decision, with the scope that these can be rejected, because I would suspect there may be certain proposals from the Commission that might not actually work when you think through them, but generally the model probably should be that these should be only rejected where there's very good reasons to reject them. Politician engagement was one question that came up from the briefing document. One question was whether politicians should be involved in the Commission themselves. I would argue that there is a place for politicians or people from the general political sector in relation to the Commission, but perhaps in the form of an advisory panel. So instead of actually having politicians on the actual Commission itself, that you have an advisory panel made up of politicians who can debate issues or discuss issues with the Commission, because when it boils down to it, really there's different experts, and there's certain expert knowledge that can only be had from politicians, whether they be TDs, councillors or senators, or whether they be local party workers. There's certain expert information that people working in politics have that other people don't have, and definitely academics don't have. So this would be a very good scope, I think, to draw on the political knowledge. So I would suggest having an advisory panel made up of politicians or maybe party headquarters people, or even
Dr. Kavanagh, no interruption. Thank you, Dr. Kavanagh.
Yeah, sorry about that. I've lost my train now.
Sorry.
Yeah, okay, I'll skip that point. So, accountability then, definitely the importance of that, as certain people were suggesting that one of the ideas be that in terms of accountability that the Commission produces reports. The idea, one precedent was referred to in previous New Zealand, where the idea that the Commission must always produce a report on the administration